In 1789, we know that France was facing many problems in the country, including the fact that King Louis XVI, who was the ruler at the time, along with his wife, were literally devouring the country and impoverishing the people to an unimaginable extent. As a result, a revolution by the French people began to overthrow King Louis. Soon after, the revolutionaries were able to reach his wife, who appeared in front of the entire nation with all the humiliation and suffering, ultimately facing the guillotine. After these events, the monarchy system was completely abolished, and the state was taken over by the revolutionaries, led by a man named Robespierre. Robespierre was a strong and controversial figure because he belonged to the revolutionaries and despised the monarchy system. However, he held the country with an iron fist and executed a large number of people every day, instilling terror among the population. Consequently, people were afraid of him. In a city on the border of France called Toulon, the people despised Robespierre and gathered the revolutionaries and the governor loyal to him. They sought the help of Spain and England, thinking that England could assist them in restoring the monarchy to the country. At that moment, there was an officer in the French army named Paul Paris. He immediately held a meeting with the most competent officers, including Napoleon Bonaparte. Paul informed Napoleon about the current situation in Toulon, stating that they needed to liberate it immediately because Toulon had the most important port in the country. This meant that England could occupy the entire country in a matter of seconds. Napoleon promised to retake the city and take control of it. The next day, he entered Toulon secretly and began to unite all the French army troops present in the city. Moreover, he collected the rusted and discarded iron and turned it into powerful weapons to strengthen his army. While his army was reinforcing itself in this manner, Napoleon would ride his horse unnoticed along the harbor, looking right and left. It was there that Napoleon always saw that if he reached the fort overlooking the sea, he would undoubtedly win this war because the fort had many cannons. If they reached it, they would eliminate all the British and Spanish ships in the sea in just moments. Over time, at night, Napoleon and his army moved towards the fort. At that time, the British army was completely preoccupied and not paying attention. So, Napoleon started to blow up a part of the fortress. He also threw ladders onto the walls of the fortress so that the army could climb them and reach the cannons in an instant. This encouraged Napoleon, and he fought alongside his soldiers. Despite being somewhat weak himself, his soldiers managed to eliminate everyone in the fortress and capture the cannons. Napoleon then started bombarding all the enemy ships in the water with these cannons until they were all destroyed. The war ended in Napoleon's victory, and the next day, Officer Paul came and thanked Napoleon for everything he had done, pointing him and expressing his joy as a general. Napoleon was very happy and walked away from the place with pride, as everyone praised him. However, after some time, a new problem arose. The people could no longer tolerate the rule of the revolutionaries, led by Robespierre. As we mentioned before, Robespierre terrorized everyone and his tyranny increased day by day. Therefore, Paul approached Napoleon, and they agreed to stage a coup against Robespierre. Indeed, the next day, a trial was held for Robespierre, and many people attended. Everyone was fanatically against him, and they tried to kill him. Robespierre tried to escape, but he didn't know what to do, so he took out a pistol and shot himself in the cheek, hoping to die. Unfortunately, the bullet didn't hit his brain, and he didn't die. As a result, despite the pain he endured, his head was later severed using a guillotine as a form of execution. From that moment on, the country descended into chaos and destruction in every corner of France because there was no governing authority. Finally, they established a government called the Directory, which consisted of 5 individuals who collectively ruled the country through consultation. During this time, Napoleon was living in the country in a very high position due to his close relationship with Paul. Although he was not part of the Directory, his position was highly elevated. In one instance, Napoleon attended a party and saw a woman named Josephine de Beauharnais. Instantly, he fell in love with her, but he controlled himself and excused himself from the party. The next day, Napoleon was in his office when a child named Eugene de Beauharnais entered. Napoleon learned that Eugene's father had been one of the officers loyal to the monarchy and had been executed along with others.
Want his father to come back, because that's the only thing left of his father, Napoleon. When Eugene found out he was Josephine's son, he immediately took his father's sword and went to Josephine's house, he gave her the sword. And it was clear that Napoleon loved her deeply, even though she was somewhat hesitant due to their difference in social status. From that moment on, my friend, things changed. Napoleon's love for Josephine grew more and more, to the point of obsession. He decided that he had to marry her. Josephine didn't love Napoleon intensely, but she appreciated his position and reputation. Overall, she accepted Napoleon's proposal, and they decided to get married. But before the wedding, something happened. A group of people wanted to attack the palace where the Directory Council was located and overthrow them, aiming to restore the monarchy. Paul sought Napoleon's help and asked him to intervene and protect them. Napoleon, with his strategic mind, gathered soldiers and cannons, positioning them midway. When he saw the approaching rebels causing chaos, he fired shots from his cannons, killing a considerable number of them and causing the rest to flee. With the situation resolved, Napoleon's fame and influence grew. Taking this opportunity, he married Josephine, and years went by. In 1798, during this time, Napoleon had already conquered several countries, including Italy. He was now leading the French army to invade Egypt. Within a short period, Napoleon managed to conquer Egypt due to his advanced weaponry, which the Egyptians didn't possess at that time. Napoleon achieved many accomplishments during this period, traveling to different countries and conquering them. However, his wife Josephine was unfaithful to him, but he had no knowledge of it. One day, while he was still in Egypt, his assistant approached him with news of Josephine's infidelity. Napoleon initially couldn't believe it and immediately dismissed the assistant, but later, he approached him again to understand the situation better. The assistant assured him that the information came from a reliable source. Immediately, Napoleon decided to leave Egypt under the care of a trusted individual named Kleber and returned to France. Upon his arrival, Napoleon was greeted with great joy and celebration by the people who had eagerly awaited his return. He rode his carriage back home, but on the way, he saw newspapers reporting about his wife's infidelity, and the scandalous news spread everywhere. In general, the story goes as follows. Josephine's husband, Napoleon, had been away since morning and hadn't returned home yet. The maid tells her that Josephine has been waiting outside the house, knocking on the door until Napoleon finally opens it. Napoleon sits in front of Josephine, feeling upset about everything she had done. Surprisingly, he forgives her for all the past incidents because of his blind love for her. He had promised her that she wouldn't cheat on him, and after some time, a man named Sires from the Directory Council approaches Napoleon. Sires tries to convince Napoleon that someone of his stature should be more than just a general. He suggests staging a coup against the other members of the council and seizing control of the state. Napoleon is greatly intrigued by this idea and sends his soldiers to each member of the council, along with resignation letters to be signed with respect and dignity. Some members resign peacefully like Paul, while others resist. However, in the end, everyone resigns after the events that unfold. Napoleon gathers all the commissioners of the state in a large hall, where they are expected to acknowledge the reality and elect Napoleon and his two companions as the rulers of the state. The commissioners, being extremely biased and dissatisfied with what happened, continue to insult Napoleon. Hearing all of this, Napoleon immediately confronts them in his anger. The commissioners, ready to kill him, chase him, but Napoleon manages to escape and locks the door behind him. He's joined by his brother, and they order 1,000,000 soldiers to enter the hall and apprehend all the treacherous commissioners easily. At that moment, everyone submits against their will, and the Directory Council is officially dissolved. The rule of the three rulers, especially Napoleon, becomes significant in the capital. His and Josephine's lives improve significantly.
Alright, so Josephine started to truly love Napoleon during this period. Meanwhile, England was causing a lot of problems for France because they saw Napoleon as a threat due to his expanding influence beyond France's borders. Therefore, Napoleon sat down with his advisor to discuss a solution to this issue. The advisor suggested that Napoleon send a peace message to England, hoping that the situation could be resolved. He also advised sending a message to Austria, as they were England's rival. Napoleon agreed to the plan and sent the messages. The next day, Talleyrand, Napoleon's foreign minister, informed him that he had met with a representative of the Austrian emperor at one of his parties, but the representative did not respond to the peace message. Talleyrand urged Napoleon to take action against them. A day later, the advisor of the King of England came to meet Napoleon to discuss matters. However, Napoleon refused to engage in conversation and instead shook their confidence by sending a peaceful reply that received no response. He warned them that they would see what he would do to them. Afterward, he left and headed to Lyon, where he informed Talleyrand that the world was not taking him seriously because they saw him as just a consul and not a sole ruler. Napoleon proposed the idea of becoming an emperor and ruling France as an empire. Talleyrand fully supported the idea, and in 1804, Napoleon was officially crowned as Emperor of France. Josephine also became an empress after the coronation, exactly 1 year later in 1805. With his army, Napoleon focused all his efforts on fighting Austria in a city called Austerlitz. At that time, Austria was fighting with the support of Russia, not England. However, Napoleon was not afraid, as he had extensively studied the area and devised an excellent plan. Napoleon strategically positioned his army in a specific part of the city. When the Austrian and Russian armies attacked him, he allowed them to come as close as possible and even sacrificed a portion of his soldiers to make them believe they were winning. Afterward, he sent a large cavalry force and surprised them all at once. Then, the Austrian and Russian armies began to withdraw and flee from the battle because they realized they were outnumbered. However, Napoleon was not satisfied with the army retreating, so he ordered cannons to be fired at them. He did this intentionally because he knew that the area where the army was positioned had frozen water, and the cannon shots would break the ice. As a result, most of the army drowned or died from the shots. After this incident, Emperor Francis of Austria approached Napoleon to negotiate peace. Napoleon calmly agreed to peace, but of course, with many conditions. However, the Russian Emperor, Alexander, did not participate in the negotiations, which bothered Napoleon because he knew that Alexander had no good intentions. Upon returning to his country, Napoleon was filled with joy and spent a long time happily with his wife, Josephine, who had finally started to truly love him. However, a problem arose when Napoleon's mother came to him one day and told him that he needed to divorce Josephine and marry someone else because they had been together for 15 years and Josephine had not been able to provide him with an heir. Currently, the French people were demanding that Napoleon become a king and rule over them, as they wanted a successor to the throne. Napoleon was upset when he heard this, but he had to follow through because it was the right thing to do. He invited Josephine for dinner and told her that they would divorce, despite his genuine love for her. Josephine left, but there was nothing else Napoleon could do. The next day, both of them went to the church and annulled their marriage. After their divorce, Josephine moved to another city and lived in a fortified palace as a gesture of goodwill for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, Napoleon, now unmarried, decided to use the marriage issue to strengthen the state. He proposed the idea of marrying one of his sisters to the Russian Emperor Alexander. He engaged in discussions with Alexander to establish a treaty and arrange a marriage between Napoleon and one of his sisters. However, Alexander was not very interested, so Napoleon proceeded to make a separate treaty with him. The treaty aimed to put economic pressure on England and prevent its ships from passing through Russia. Eventually, England would be deceived, and Alexander agreed to such an arrangement because he also disliked England, just like Napoleon did. On the other hand, at the same time, Napoleon's advisor met with the advisor of Emperor Francis of Austria and requested that Napoleon marry the emperor's daughter, Marie-Louise. The advisor agreed to this proposal, and the next day, Marie was with Napoleon, and they got married. However, their happiness didn't last long, my friend. Shortly after, Napoleon's heir was born and they named him after his father. Napoleon was overjoyed, and out of his happiness, he went to see Josephine and greeted her. Josephine, despite her sadness, was also happy for Napoleon that he had an heir. After some time, news reached Napoleon that Russia had broken the alliance with him and opened the passage for England, allowing them to trade and strengthen their economy. Napoleon was frustrated once again and decided to occupy all of Russia. In 1812, Napoleon managed to convince Germany, Poland, Italy, and Austria to provide him with a large army. He gathered a massive force of 600,000 soldiers to invade Russia. But, my friend, throughout history, there has always been a warning: beware of attempting to invade Russia from its own land. However, Napoleon ignored this warning and proceeded with his plan to invade Russia. As they marched towards Moscow, a section of the Russian army ambushed them and attacked them with cannons from the midst of the forest. The Russian soldiers then entered the forest, and at that moment, the remaining soldiers of Napoleon's army hid in the woods. While the Russian soldiers were hunting them down with great skill, suddenly, Napoleon's soldiers emerged from the forest and encountered a small portion of the Russian army waiting for them with cannons outside the forest. Immediately, a major battle ensued. Despite the fact that it was a small portion of the Russian army that was present, they managed to kill around 7,000 soldiers from Napoleon's army. However, due to the larger size of Napoleon's army, they ultimately emerged victorious. Napoleon was ecstatic with this victory and continued onward towards Moscow. After a few more days, they reached Moscow, but to their surprise, the city was completely empty. Alexander had evacuated the city entirely, leaving it to Napoleon. In that moment, Napoleon felt triumphant and settled with his soldiers in Moscow. However, the bigger problem arose when, during the night, he heard the sound of a massive fire. He went to investigate what was happening, as Moscow was engulfed in flames. Napoleon couldn't understand who had caused this. The soldiers informed him that the Russians had set fire to the city to prevent them from finding shelter and to force them to retreat. Napoleon had initially planned to retreat and march towards the Russians, but his advisors advised against it, warning him about the harsh Russian winter and the unforgiving forests where the Russians had the advantage of knowledge and hunting skills. Napoleon insisted and took the remaining soldiers with him to invade Russia in order to defeat Alexander. Despite the harsh winter, which posed a problem as the soldiers were dying from the cold, hunger, and disease, Napoleon faced a difficult situation. Thousands of soldiers were dying, so Napoleon took all the soldiers and returned to France, disappointed. When Napoleon returned to France, he only had 4,000 soldiers left out of the original 600,000, which was a disaster. Consequently, he was removed from his position as emperor and exiled to a distant island, where he would spend the rest of his days. However, with all due respect, Napoleon at that time did not accept what was happening to him. Nevertheless, he adapted to his situation and lived with it. But all of that changed when he received a proposal from Emperor Alexander of Russia to marry Josephine. You could say that Josephine was crazy and her love for power blinded her, so she tentatively agreed to the proposal. The newspapers spread the news, and when Napoleon saw this, he was furious. He sent a message to Josephine saying that he was returning to France. You could say that Josephine was almost doing all of this with Alexander to provoke Napoleon and make him jealous. Now, Napoleon was very happy because Josephine was waiting for him, but unfortunately, Josephine fell ill during this time and was on the verge of life and death. In the end, Napoleon took some of his soldiers and they stole a ship from a group of pirates at sea. Immediately, they returned to France. Afterwards, Napoleon continued his march towards the capital to reclaim his rule. Literally, every time he saw any soldier walking on the street, they immediately joined him. Despite everything that had happened, the soldiers still respected him to the extent that we see groups of soldiers standing to prevent Napoleon from reaching the capital, but they ended up joining him after he convinced them. Meanwhile, another emperor was waiting for Napoleon in France. At that time, Napoleon went to visit Josephine, but unfortunately, he was met by her maid who informed him that Josephine had died due to an illness that had afflicted her. Napoleon was extremely devastated and couldn't control himself. However, he gathered himself and returned to the capital because there was a war looming at the doorstep at that time. On the other hand, all the rulers of European countries held a meeting with the Emperor of England. They decided to form a large alliance and eliminate Napoleon completely because he was not planning to back down. Napoleon, at that time, became aware of the alliance being formed against him. He gathered his army and spoke to them about why all the countries that had allied with England would not give their armies to England, making it impossible for Napoleon to win. However, Napoleon realized that if he fought England alone, then each country would fight individually, and he could possibly win. With that in mind, Napoleon started preparing for war against England. In 1815, the Great War began, with the English army standing on one side and Napoleon's army on the other. The crucial point here was that Napoleon's army was waiting for the rain to stop so they could engage in battle, while the English army was waiting for their allies to join them with their armies. The reinforcements were coming to the English army, and they would arrive in precisely 5 hours. At that moment, Napoleon received news of this and decided to start the battle immediately before the supplies arrived. Napoleon initiated the attack with cannons, followed by sending his troops and all the cavalry he had. However, the problem was that England had devised a very smart formation, like squares, making it difficult for the cavalry to penetrate their ranks. As a result, Napoleon's army was being killed one by one with ease. Napoleon, upon seeing his army in this state, left to rally and boost their morale. Unfortunately, while he was fighting with his army, a large portion of the Allied army of England arrived from the other side, completely surprising Napoleon. He managed to escape, but his army was wiped out shortly afterwards. Within less than a year, we find that Napoleon surrendered himself on one of England's ships. He returned to France but found no further support from anyone, and nobody loved him anymore. He surrendered himself to England at that moment. The Emperor of England then informed him that all the Allies had voted to either kill him or exile him. Therefore, he was exiled to a distant and isolated island called St. Helena, where he would spend the rest of his life under strict surveillance. Napoleon was deeply disappointed with such a decision, but he accepted his fate and lived in exile for many years, approximately 5 or 6 years. However, throughout that period, he never forgot France or Josephine. In any case, after these 5 or 6 years, Napoleon suddenly died, and it is said that he died due to stomach cancer that had unexpectedly emerged. But other people claim that he was poisoned, and some say he committed suicide. Only God knows the truth. I must say, my friend, in the end, Napoleon died after engaging in numerous wars that caused the deaths of 3 million soldiers who served under him, and here's that end. But there is one thing you need to do. Please support us by liking and subscribing to the channel to receive all the latest updates. And now we leave you in peace. We wish you a good night and sweet dreams.